Paper 167. The Visit to Philadelphia. Throughout this period of the Perean ministry, when mention is made of Jesus and the apostles visiting the various localities where the 70 were at work, it should be recalled that, as a rule, only 10 were with him, since it was the practice to leave at least 2 of the apostles at Pella to instruct the multitude. As Jesus prepared to go on to Philadelphia, Simon Peter and his brother Andrew returned to the Pella encampment to teach the crowds there assembled. When the Master left the camp at Pella to visit about Perea, it was not uncommon for from 300 to 500 of the campers to follow him. When he arrived at Philadelphia, he was accompanied by over 600 followers. No miracles had attended the recent preaching tour through the Decapolis, and, excepting the cleansing of the 10 lepers, thus far there had been no miracles on this Perean mission. This was a period when the gospel was proclaimed with power, without miracles, and most of the time without the personal presence of Jesus or even of his apostles. Jesus and the 10 apostles arrived at Philadelphia on Wednesday, February 22, and spent Thursday and Friday resting from their recent travels and labors. That Friday night James spoke in the synagogue, and a general council was called for the following evening. They were much rejoiced over the progress of the gospel at Philadelphia and among the nearby villages. The messengers of David also brought word of the further advancement of the kingdom throughout Palestine, as well as good news from Alexandria and Damascus. 1. Breakfast with the Pharisees. There lived in Philadelphia a very wealthy and influential Pharisee who had accepted the teachings of Abner, and who invited Jesus to his house Sabbath morning for breakfast. It was known that Jesus was expected in Philadelphia at this time, so a large number of visitors, among them many Pharisees, had come over from Jerusalem and from elsewhere. Accordingly, about 40 of these leading men and a few lawyers were bidden to this breakfast, which had been arranged in honor of the Master. As Jesus lingered by the door, speaking with Abner, and after the host had seated himself, there came into the room one of the leading Pharisees of Jerusalem, a member of the Sanhedrin, and, as was his habit, he made straight for the seat of honor at the left of the host. But since this place had been reserved for the Master, and that on the right for Abner, the host beckoned the Jerusalem Pharisee to sit 4 seats to the left, and this dignitary was much offended because he did not receive the seat of honor. Soon they were all seated and enjoying the visiting among themselves, since the majority of those present were disciples of Jesus, or else were friendly to the gospel. Only his enemies took notice of the fact that he did not observe the ceremonial washing of his hands before he sat down to eat. Abner washed his hands at the beginning of the meal, but not during the serving. Near the end of the meal there came in from the street a man long afflicted with a chronic disease, and now in a dropsical condition. This man was a believer, having recently been baptized by Abner's associates. He made no request of Jesus for healing, but the Master knew full well that this afflicted man came to this breakfast hoping thereby to escape the crowds which thronged him, and thus be more likely to engage his attention. This man knew that few miracles were then being performed. However, he had reasoned in his heart that his sorry plight might possibly appeal to the Master's compassion. And he was not mistaken, for, when he entered the room, both Jesus and the self-righteous Pharisee from Jerusalem took notice of him. The Pharisee was not slow to voice his resentment that such a one should be permitted to enter the room. But Jesus looked upon the sick man and smiled so benignly that he drew near and sat down upon the floor. As the meal was ending, the Master looked over his fellow guests, and then, after glancing significantly at the man with dropsy, said, "My friends, teachers in Israel, and learned lawyers, I would like to ask you a question. Is it lawful to heal the sick and afflicted on the Sabbath day, or not?" But those who were there present knew Jesus too well. They held their peace. They answered not his question. Then went Jesus over to where the sick man sat, and, taking him by the hand, said, "Arise, and go your way. You have not asked to be healed, but I know the desire of your heart and the faith of your soul." Before the man left the room, Jesus returned to his seat and, addressing those at the table, said, "Such works my Father does, not to tempt you into the kingdom, but to reveal himself to those who are already in the kingdom. You can perceive that it would be like the Father to do just such things, because which one of you, having a favorite animal that fell in the well on the Sabbath day, would not go right out and draw him up? And since no one would answer him, and inasmuch as his host evidently approved of what was going on, Jesus stood up and spoke to all present. My brethren, when you are bidden to a marriage feast, sit not down in the chief seat, lest perchance a more honored man than you has been invited, and the host will have to come to you and request that you give your place to this other and honored guest. In this event, with shame you will be required to take a lower place at the table. When you are bidden to a feast, it would be the part of wisdom, on arriving at the festive table, to seek for the lowest place and take your seat therein, so that, when the host looks over the guests, he may say to you, My friend, why sit in the seat of the least? Come up higher. And thus will such a one have glory in the presence of his fellow guests. Forget not, every one who exalts himself shall be humbled, while he who truly humbles himself shall be exalted. Therefore, when you entertain at dinner or give a supper, invite not always your friends, your brethren, your kinsmen, or your rich neighbors, that they in return may bid you to their feasts, and thus will you be recompensed. When you give a banquet, sometimes bid the poor, the maimed, and the blind. In this way you shall be blessed in your heart, for you well know that the lame and the halt cannot repay you for your loving ministry. 2. Parable of the Great Supper. As Jesus finished speaking at the breakfast table of the Pharisee, one of the lawyers present, desiring to relieve the silence, thoughtlessly said, Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God, that being a common saying of those days. And then Jesus spoke a parable, which even his friendly host was compelled to take to heart. He said, A certain ruler gave a great supper, and having bidden many guests, he dispatched his servants at supper time to say to those who were invited, Come, for everything is now ready. And they all with one accord began to make excuses. The first said, I have just bought a farm, and I must needs go to prove it. I pray you have me excused. Another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I must go to receive them. I pray you have me excused. And another said, I have just married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So the servants went back and reported this to their master. When the master of the house heard this, he was very angry, and turning to his servants, he said, I have made ready this marriage feast, the fatlings are killed, and all is in readiness for my guests, but they have spurned my invitation. They have gone every man after his lands and his merchandise, and they even show disrespect to my servants who bid them come to my feast. Go out quickly, therefore, into the streets and lanes of the city, out into the highways and the byways, and bring hither the poor and the outcast, the blind and the lame, that the marriage feast may have guests. And the servants did as their Lord commanded, and even then there was room for more guests. Then said the Lord to his servants, Go now out into the roads and the countryside, and constrain those who are there to come in, that my house may be filled. I declare that none of those who were first bidden shall taste of my supper. And the servants did as their master commanded, and the house was filled. And when they heard these words, they departed. Every man went to his own place. At least one of the sneering Pharisees present that morning comprehended the meaning of this parable, for he was baptized that day, and made public confession of his faith in the gospel of the kingdom. Abner preached on this parable that night at the general council of believers. The next day all of the apostles engaged in the philosophic exercise of endeavoring to interpret the meaning of this parable of the Great Supper. Though Jesus listened with interest to all of these differing interpretations, he steadfastly refused to offer them further help in understanding the parable. He would only say, Let every man find out the meaning for himself and in his own soul. 3. The woman with the spirit of infirmity. Abner had arranged for the master to teach in the synagogue on this Sabbath day, the first time Jesus had appeared in a synagogue, since they had all been closed to his teachings by order of the Sanhedrin. At the conclusion of the service, Jesus looked down before him upon an elderly woman who wore a downcast expression, and who was much bent in form. This woman had long been fear-ridden, and all joy had passed out of her life. As Jesus stepped down from the pulpit, he went over to her and,